So welcome to Digital Catapult's second webinar of our masterclass series. Today we're going to be focusing on the use of immersive technologies to deploy effective training, learning and development within enterprise workforces. So my name's Emily Savage, and over the next 90 minutes we're going to be taking you through a whole range of information and use cases brought to you by lots of different experts to give you a taster of what it's like and what you need to think about when you are looking to use immersive technology for training your workforce. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. And that's great. I can see some people are still joining. Welcome. So first of all, this session is recorded. It's all being recorded. So don't worry if you do need to pop out for a second. We'll be able to send it through afterwards and you can share it with your colleagues as well. You'll have noticed that your camera and your microphone are both switched off. So that's just to avoid distraction with the various speakers. So don't worry, we do know you're there. Firstly, there is an opportunity to ask our speakers some questions. So feel free to submit your questions. You can see it, there's a box that you can see on the menu. And we'll be picking the most upvoted questions at the end of the session to ask to the panel and to the speakers. So to upvote them, you just click on the thumbs up button. So please do that, enter them and vote on other people's as well. We've also got a few live polls, about 3 or 4 live polls throughout the 90 minutes. So again, when they pop up, please do vote. It's just really fun to see what's going on and what people are thinking and seeing out there. So excellent, that's given us all a bit of more time. So I am going to introduce now who we've got joining us over the next 90 minutes. So as I said, we've got this brilliant, diverse collection of experts and speakers joining you. Everyone will introduce themselves as they pop on, but just to give you an overview, with us today we've got Dr. Helen Dudfield, who's the Chief Scientist for Training at Kinetic. We've got Sam Watts, who's the Immersive Partnerships at Make Real. We've got James Watson, who's the Chief Marketing Officer at Immerse. We've got both Craig and Mark from Lloyds Bank, so Learning Delivery Manager and Learning Design Manager, respectively. And then we've got our very own Aki Javanan, who's the Senior Immersive Experience Designer here with us at Digital Catapult. So thank you all so much for joining. It's really great to have your expertise. It's been really great to get to know you all as well during the preparation for this. All right, so as mentioned, we've got these poll questions, so we thought we'd start off with one so everyone knows how the tool works. Really nice, easy one, not about technology at all, but actually about the scenario that you're facing now as a business. So every business, big and small, needs to be able to train its workforce. And I want you to just have a think about what you think the main challenges are that your company is facing when delivering training in the current climate. And you can tick multiple options here, but what are some of the stresses and strains you're feeling? Is it not being able to deliver classroom style training, that en masse collective style training that we're so used to having? Is it the need to upskill the new workforce and those that have been out of action or furloughed for the last few months? Is it not being able to give a close-up demonstration of your product? You're not able to all gather around a new product, a new tool, a new bit of machinery and really get to know it? Is it the actual legwork that's involved in shifting your materials from online or paper format, the online and shifting them onto the online and virtual formats for delivering remote training when everyone's at home? Or actually, are you not feeling you have too many challenges? So you should now see this question pop up in front of you. So if you vote on what you feel your major challenges are, obviously tick other if you don't think we've hit the nail on the head there. You've got kind of 20 seconds or so. I can see how many of you have voted, so go for it. That's great. About a third of you. Keep voting. Excellent. All right, this is really good. Perfect. So the poll's closed. Excellent. Thanks, guys, on the back end there. So as we can see that the top answer there, we've got two very high answers: not being able to have that classroom training, and also having to shift all of your materials from classroom and traditional formats onto online formats. So I think that's probably no big surprise to any of us. We're all really struggling with how we communicate and interact with each other during these times, and training is something that's suffering a lot. So thank you for that. Okay, just before we kick off in depth, I just want to give a very quick overview of who we are at Catapult, because some of you will know us well, some may never have heard of us. So we are the UK's leading digital innovation centre. So we're here with this key aim of accelerating the early adoption of advanced digital technology within the UK. We are set up by government about 6 years ago, and we run a huge range of projects and work with lots of different companies, both private and public. In terms of advanced digital, this is what we mean. So we look at it in regards to 4 different areas, looking at future networks, say 5G, IoT, right the way through to artificial intelligence, distributed ledger systems, and then of course immersive technology, which is what we're talking about today. In that we include virtual reality, augmented reality, haptics, etc. In regards to what we do, as I say, it covers a big expanse of things, but we do things from building and running facilities, so that includes labs and test beds. We also deliver a whole range of accelerator programs. Some of you might have heard of Creative XR or Augmental. We also convene lots of companies around research and development, so help companies to collectively win R&D grants. And then lastly, we help industry specifically to shape and develop their new and industry-ready solutions. So working with enterprise to make prototypes and to help them understand these technology areas, which is exactly what we're doing today. All right, so let's jump straight into the topic of this webinar. So really digging into training the next workforce and how to do that with Immersive. I think it's really obvious to everyone, I'm sure, here that coronavirus has imposed massive restrictions on social distancing measures, and doing any face-to-face training is incredibly hard right now. And as a result, we've seen this surge. We've seen this surge in industry turning to immersive, new bits of industry, from the NHS using immersive technology to help upskill its workforce, right the way through to Rolls-Royce as well, introducing virtual reality in maintenance training. So the tools for deploying immersive are definitely not new. We've always had those tools. However, that doesn't mean that it becomes any less risky for companies that want to take that first step, take the plunge into deploying an immersive technology-led program for delivering their training. So today, that's what we want to try and start you on the journey of, to start you really thinking about what are the benefits of immersive, when is it applicable to use it, what are some of the technology considerations, and how do you actually start on your immersive training journey. We're also going to be digging a little bit into that ROI. So how can you be evidencing some of the return on investment that you'll get when you deploy a new immersive project. We're going to have 2 great case studies, as I mentioned, one from Kinetic and one from Lloyds Bank, who both used immersive in really different ways. Kinetic far more around specific scenario training for very hard to achieve circumstances, and Lloyds have been using it a lot more for soft skills training. So at the end of the session, as I said, we'll have a panel session and the chance for some question and answers. So let's start with the absolute basics. Why is immersive technology considered to be an exciting new tool to add to the many array of different tools that can be used for training? I think it boils down to its incredible ability to transport people, to basically do exactly what it says on the tin and to immerse them in the environments that they're not familiar with. And I think most importantly, it's not just about the physical environments, but also the mental environments. So as we'll hear later from Lloyds Bank, the key to using immersive for soft skills training is its ability to place people in scenarios and mental situations which they may be uncomfortable or unfamiliar with. And that is then, you're able to then use it to help those people navigate the scenarios in a space that's safe and therefore improve their ability to deal with them. So we're going to have the next poll here. I know some of you answered this question when you would have signed up for the webinar, but it's really great for us all to have a look at now. So where do you feel you are on your immersive training journey? So in regards to your own company, are you still very much learning, understanding, listening to webinars like this? Have you started to identify some of the ways in which your company could use it? Are you actually at the point of starting to contact, companies that could help you deliver? So really being able to gather the info around delivery. Are you building a proof of concept? Are you maybe now scaling? Or are you actually feeling that you guys are immersive leaders yourself? So we're just going to pop that question up. So feel free, 20 seconds to answer that best indicates where you are. And again, I realize we've probably got a whole range of companies on this call. Some of you I know from having looked through are also in the field of delivering training. So it's great to see where you are as well. Brilliant. All right, here we go. So that's great. That's great. Okay, the majority of people here are you're still on that learning journey. You're right at the beginning, and that's really good because hopefully this webinar in itself will just give you some of the baseline on what you need to think about. So first of all, let's just recap on what we mean by immersive, because it's one of those words that massively gets, it gets overused and can have lots of different meanings. So when we talk about immersive, we are thinking, roughly speaking, about these 4 areas. So you've got virtual reality, which is very much normally thought of as headset based. You're putting on a headset, you're entering into a different world. And that world may well include animations, computer generated or 360-degree imagery inside that headset. Augmented and mixed reality is more about when you're augmenting the real world around you, and you might be experiencing that through a set of glasses, augmented glasses that you can see in that picture, or through mobile phone, but it's adding a layer of information that gives contextual background and richness to the real scenario around you. You've then got haptics technology, and haptics technology is there to enable you to feel and sense some of the real sensations that you feel in the real world, but it's allowing you to feel and sense those sensations in regard to what you're seeing in the virtual world. So that pair of gloves there allows you to feel textures and resistance that regard objects that you're seeing in the virtual headset to add that layer of reality. And then finally, I think it's really important to add that when we're talking about immersive, we don't necessarily mean it has to be delivered through a headset. The very notion of delivering and using 3D and real-time content can also be utilized within linear screens as well. So you're able to utilize that 3D content in a whole range of different methodologies, whether you're deploying it in a headset or whether you're utilizing it on screens for people so that they can learn in a richer context when they're at home. So why should you even begin to start thinking about making that journey and utilizing immersive technology for your training? I think at the very heart of it, it's about what you can achieve in both scenarios. So if you think about traditional classroom-based training, the maximum you can achieve, the maximum you can hope for is to have a participatory experience, question and answer, your classroom engaging with the trainer. Whereas with immersive, this is where you move into the unforgettable category. This is where you can deliver things that people will have stuck into their memory because it felt so real. And of course, that means is that you increase the knowledge. If people really felt like they were there, if people really felt like they emotionally had to connect with that situation, then it really helps to embed it into their brain. And that also means you can communicate specific scenarios, things like this picture's indicating here with putting out a fire. You can't communicate that kind of thing through a PowerPoint in a classroom. I think also a very, very interesting advantage is the ability and the advantages that you have as the trainer. You are able to have a second pair of eyes on the situation. So if you're in HR and you want to know how people are actually performing and achieving, you can get real feedback on that. You can know how they're engaging, what they're learning. And that allows you to influence the subtle behavior as well. Things like unconscious bias, which we'll talk about a bit later. Most importantly, right now, it allows you to train from a distance in a way that is far, far more engaging than simply training over a Zoom call or a PC. So just briefly, I want to talk about why now. Why do we as Catapult think there is an increased interest and value in this area? So not long before COVID, there was a report that came out from the CIPD and Accenture about the learning and skills environment within the UK. And when asked, what was the adoption of emerging technologies for training by UK companies, the results were a little bit horrifying. We only have 12% of those companies saying that they used mobile apps. And when you move to virtual reality and augmented reality, it's even lower. So the adoption of these emerging technologies for training is still really quite sluggish, which is worrying. However, this pandemic is definitely accelerating that need to harness the human and digital skills and bring it all together in a way that can deliver greater value and impact. So on that note, let's just have a quick poll again and ask, so how prepared do you feel your company is at the moment to deliver training? So to deliver the training that's needed right now in this new normal world that we're living in, that we're not quite sure how long it will go on for. Do you feel you have a clear deployment methodology that's now starting to reach people in a more socially distant way? Are you in the process of reassessing how you deliver your training, or do you actually feel a little bit unprepared? So if you could just answer that. We've got 20 seconds or so for you guys to answer that. Excellent. All right, we've got a very clear answer coming out here, I think. Okay, all right, and we'll just stop it there. Okay, so yeah, you've got the results in front of you. Sorry, I just realized I jumped on my slide. So you can really clearly see that actually lots of people are in that process of reassessing, which again is really good timing, I think, to understand a little bit more of this information because you are at that stage of trying to see what's out there, how you could do things differently. But that's very promising to see how many people are really actively changing their habits. So a real quick recap here on, I think it's important to remember that immersive technology is not suitable for delivering every single type of training. There are some areas of training that are definitely more suited to being delivered through immersive. I think some of the obvious ones are those kind of expensive, hard to access, dangerous, and health and safety related training things that simply you don't want to or can't afford to keep putting people into time and time again. Immersive, putting on a VR headset and taking people into one of those dangerous scenarios is absolutely perfect for doing it in a safe way and a way that you can afford. But I think some of the other areas are maybe not as well documented so far. So there's also a very interesting ability for immersive to deliver with group training. So if you need to train a group of people on how to come together around interacting and coordinating for a certain scenario, and right now that's very hard to do, but you still need to prepare them for certain situations or future situations, then again, immersive and using those headsets can do it in a really easily accessible way. We will also talk a little bit, of course, about the soft skills and how we can be using immersive for approaching some of those less tangible skills, those skills that do require you to be tapping into the way that someone's mind works, and you need them to emotionally connect with what's going on. I think another area to recommend thinking about is when training is going to be changing rapidly around a product. So if you've got a product or a scenario or service that rapidly updates, and therefore it's expensive to kind of keep redoing the training, with immersive, you can have that content built in 3D and you're just doing subtle tweaks as that product also is updating, and you can be utilizing some of the 3D models for that product and placing them into the scenario for the training as you keep updating that. So I'm very quickly going to talk about the ROI, and then we will hand over to our case studies. So one of the first things I'm sure a lot of you will be asked if you start to recommend using immersive for training up to your management teams and up to your boards is to show off what the ROI is. Why bother? Why is it worth the cost? There are lots of different metrics that are starting to show themselves as to how you can prove out the ROI of using immersive, and these are just a handful of them. So first of all, the time taken to complete a certain activity. There are very strong metrics already that indicate that people will be able to learn and repeat a task far quicker if they've done it in a way that feels real and natural. The product knowledge and awareness. Again, if someone's able to explore a product, explore it in 3D, explore a scenario, see all the different parts that could go wrong and what they need to do, they are far more likely to engage their inquisitive nature, and therefore have a better knowledge of that, and be able to recall it even better. And that leads me on to the final one there as well, the knowledge retention. This idea of imprinting on someone's memory because they feel like it was a real scenario means that they'll recall that knowledge over and over again for a longer period after the initial training, which again, you can assess and you can take as a metric. Something that I'll talk about just a little bit on the next slide is actually looking as well at how you can measure the ROI when you start to look at scaling. So it's important to not just think about the cost of the initial upfront cost of producing the immersive content, but actually looking at how it compares to classroom or traditional training once you start to scale. So for example, if you are wanting to deliver soft skills training, you often use actors for that. And scaling actor one-to-one interaction for a workforce of 3,000 is incredibly expensive. And therefore, if you compare it to a piece of immersive content that you've designed and delivered to do exactly the same thing, you start to see the ROI and the payoff. On that note, so PwC have recently released a report to look at exactly that, look at the ROI for soft skills training. Really interesting report. I'd very much recommend reading it. But some of the headlines that came out of that, and it's worth noting that they did some sample studies to compare classroom learning, e-learning, so just over the computer, and then virtual learning. And these are some of the headlines that came out. So they found that with virtual learners, they completed the training 4 times faster than classroom training. They noticed a 35% improvement in confidence of the virtual learners compared to the e-learners. So people really felt like they knew that product, knew that situation. The V-learners they found is cost effective when done at large scale, exactly as I was saying. So at the 3,000 learner mark, the VR costs became 52% less than classroom. So really interesting to look at scaling when you're, again, looking at the ROI. They also felt that the virtual learners felt 3.75% times more emotionally connected to the content than the classroom learners. So the emotional pull is really there, and that they were more focused than their e-learning peers. So these are all very, very important things that we now have evidence, hard evidence coming through on this, which we didn't have a year or 2 years ago, that really can underpin why it's so valuable. So on that note, I'm going to hand over now to a couple of case studies. First of all, we're going to hear from Lloyds Bank, and I'm going to hand over to Mark and Craig, who will introduce themselves. They have been producing an amazing project with Make Real as well, who you'll be hearing from later on. Bear with me, I'm now just going to change over the screen sharing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Mark and Craig are going to take over.
Okay, great.
Brilliant. Yeah, we've got you. All right. Well, thanks very much. Mark, Craig, please introduce yourselves to the listeners, and I'll be back in 15 minutes or so.
Thanks, Emily, and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Mark Poole, Digital Learning Design Manager at Lloyds Banking Group. And my role really has a clear focus on innovation, media and technology more broadly. So it was myself that worked closely with Make Real at the beginning to identify VR as a media, set the strategy, spot the use case, and then working really, really closely with my colleague, Craig Piper. I'll introduce Craig.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Craig Piper, Learning Delivery Manager in Lloyds Banking Group, and I was the person primarily behind the design and deployment of the VR experiences that we've used in Lloyds.
Great, thank you, Craig. So what we're going to cover off in today's session, so we're going to explore the journey of virtual reality and immersive learning more broadly within Lloyds Banking Group. How we've successfully deployed VR critically as a viable media for soft skills learning, which hopefully will resonate with many people on the call today. Craig will take you through the story behind our first 3 bespoke, fully immersive VR experiences that we have deployed and launched already. We'll look at the roadmap for 2020 and beyond, and also give a little bit of sort of steer really as to how that has changed or where the focus is now switched as a result of obviously the current circumstances. And throughout the presentation today, there are some top tips that you can take away for you to start deploying VR within your own organisations. So why VR? Why have we invested in VR? So learning and development of our colleagues is a key focus within Lloyds Banking Group right now. And in fact, it's a key part of our group strategy to really develop the skills and capabilities of our workforce to equip them for the future. And to do that, we really need to offer an industry-leading, world-class learner experience. We need to transform the group for success in a digital world, and that means investing in our colleagues to help them build the capabilities they need for the future. We were led by what our colleagues were telling us. So in a survey of over 6,000 colleagues, as part of colleague learner journey research, we were told that the way colleagues want to learn in the future is how they learn outside of work. So there is no real difference between how typically they learn inside the corporate world and how they learn personally. So learning work the same as you do out of work. So we started our journey in January 2018 and formed a partnership with a recognised expert who could really help show us the ropes, and they were Make Real. So Make Real were our external partner, and I have to say we're absolutely critical to our success. They've got decades of experience in the industry. They were able to work with us in partnership, helping us to develop our foundations, strategy and approach. And bearing in mind, we were coming into this at the start of 2018, not really knowing very much at all. We knew about VR, we knew about the technology. We thought this could add value in Lloyds, but we didn't quite know where at that point. So we worked very much with Make Real to sort of start to flesh that strategy and the background out. We didn't just wake up though one morning and think, let's try a bit of VR, that sounds fun. We had to create a strategy, a business plan and a proposal. We needed buy-in, not just from senior leaders in terms of the budget, but we needed buy-in from colleagues. VR very much is immediate. You need to experience. It's not something you can watch and say, oh yeah, that looks good. You physically need to experience something. So we went along to conferences, events, meetings, seminars, every opportunity we could. Throughout 2018, we took along with us some sample VR headsets, and Make Real created a prototype for us. So this is a real life proof of concept demonstrator that was relevant to colleagues at Lloyds. So it was more of a soft skill demonstrator, and it just gave people an idea and a feel for what VR is. And that was designed just to warm people up, get people interested, curious and excited potentially in terms of VR and immersive learning. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, but of course we still needed a use case, a reason to consider VR, but critically, where will VR add the real value? Remembering, of course, we are a bank, we are financial services, and the skills and capabilities that colleagues need really are very different. They're more behavioural, they're more interaction, soft skill based, rather than hard practical skills such as machine learning or operating a task or completing a task. And this, of course, had never really been done in the soft skill arena before. So we needed to really prove that this new way of immersive learning will add value in the long term, not just the short term. And also that it's not just a fad, that actually it has long-term future, and the media itself will add real value to what we currently do as a group. And that critically, the technology needed to help, not hinder as well. And technology, of course, evolves and develops so quickly. It's hard for large-scale organisations to keep up with that pace of change in the technology world. So again, we needed to make sure the technology was right for us at the right time. So our first two tips really, learn the ropes, work with an expert that can help and form your own strategy for this media and really benefit and leverage that. That will set you on good stead to allow you to then raise the interest, raise the curiosity in the media throughout your organisation through any opportunity you have through demonstrations and showcases. And at that point, I'll hand over to Craig, who will talk you through the story of our first 3 fully immersive VR experiences. Craig.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah, so I came into this this VR journey while Mark had already progressed it significantly, and I came in at the point where we were now looking for a proof of concept experience to really just see the benefits and test it out with live audiences, and that was our resilience program. Within Lloyds Banking Group, we have a really well-established program on personal resilience, teaching people how to manage their stress and how to be more resilient. But the challenge we were having was, how do we really bring that to life? The difficulty is resilience is a very kind of soft topic, very personal, and it can sometimes be quite difficult to discuss. So we needed to really bring it to life to show people what it's like when people have high resilience or when they have low resilience. Now, one way you can do that is a role play. Well, let's face facts. When the trainer says, let's do a role play, everybody's heart sinks. Another way to do it is to bring in actors, but as already been said, that is phenomenally expensive, especially at scale. And keep in mind, we're training a couple of thousand colleagues a year on this program, so that would have just been way too much, way too expensive. So we settled on virtual reality as a way that we could bring the training to life. We could show people what resilience looks like in different states, but we could do so while maintaining psychological safety, because everyone's in their own headset. It's a personal experience. They can go through it at their own pace and in their own way. So we came up with a scenario working with Make Real, our supplier, where you enter the office, you enter a typical kind of Lloyds Banking Group office based on photo reference of real offices. And you hear rumors that there's some sort of restructure on the way. There's some sort of, maybe redundancy is coming. And you meet 6 characters, the characters you see on the screen, and all of them are responding to this rumor in very different ways. Some are happy, some are like, yeah, show me the money. Other people are really worried. And you get to explore why each of the 6 characters is feeling this way. And you get to find out certain things which are going on in their personal lives, which may be impacting them. So the 4 different resilient states you see on the screen there, performance, recovery, survival, and burnout, are really, really brought to life. And this was designed as merely an experience. We weren't looking for anyone to achieve anything from it. It was, so it came kind of at the end of the workshop, and it was really just to say, here is what it actually looks like. So when you leave this training room, you can recognize resilience, different states of resilience in yourself, but you can also recognize it in other people as well. And you're given some coaching and some tips on how to deal with it when you do see it in other people, how to speak to other people. And really, VR is one of the few media I can think of which really allows us to do that at scale and at a reasonable cost. So we've got 2 more tips for you on the bottom of the screen there. The first one is, think about where VR is going to add real value to you. In other words, don't think about it as a gimmick, as a toy, as something shiny, as something to impress, but use it in scenarios that would otherwise be impossible or prohibitively expensive to create. And also, don't be too ambitious at the start. This scenario was actually a relatively small one. It only had about 150 odd bits of dialogue in it that the characters spoke, but that was enough to give people enough choice for it to be really engaging. But it was small enough that it wasn't hugely expensive to produce and didn't take a huge amount of time. So we were able to quite quickly get it up and running and show our stakeholders, our managers, and really get them on side with, here is how VR works. Moving on to our next experience, with the kind of credibility in VR that we had built on the first one, we were able to really go headlong into this second experience. And again, we chose to create something that would otherwise be really quite difficult to create, and that's managing relationships with both internal stakeholders and external clients. We actually have a range of different courses that touch on this subject. So we came up with a slightly crazy idea that we could come up with a sufficiently large VR experience that would create a bank of examples of what it's like to deal with different internal and external relationships, different types of characters, different kind of situations and environments. But that could go into each of these courses. So courses on managing stakeholders, on negotiations, on psychological type, on managing with clients. And this time we really did start to push the medium. So it's a similar kind of build, and then it's built around a conversation tree, but much, much larger. It has to be said, the graphics, the lip syncing, the facial expressions, the characters came an awful long way in between these 2 experiences. And I think you can just tell from the pictures on the screen, the leap in quality. But also we went much bigger. So whereas the first experience had about 150 bits of dialogue, this had over 1,500, and it had 12 different scenarios. But what that allowed us to do, it allowed us to put this one VR experience into 5 different learning offerings. So while it was considerably more expensive to develop, it actually offered greater value for money when you consider a kind of per learning experience cost. So that's our 5th tip. Consider your return on investment. And after you've done your initial proof of concept, think about where are you going to get most bang for your buck? Where are you going to get most return on the investment that you make? Now, the 3rd VR experience we developed was around delivering business presentations. This was a well-established learning offering within Lloyds Banking Group, but at the time it was delivered in a training room with a trainer, and people would kind of practice presentations in the training room. So we wanted to create something that would really allow for much more kind of realism. And as has been said, putting our colleagues in the same emotional space they are when they're actually in a room full of people delivering a presentation for real, not just in the training room. So this was a completely different approach, because whereas the first 2 experiences were conversation tree based, this was all about delivering. So you stick your VR headset on, you deliver a presentation, and you deliver it to the room full of people you see on the screen there in front of you. And as you can see, they don't look like such a friendly bunch. You're instantly placed in that emotional space. You actually start the experience waiting in a lobby, and you have to open the door and walk into the room as you would in a real presentation. It has the ability for everyone to upload their own presentation. So we're not asking people to learn a script. They can deliver what they're comfortable with, and you deliver it. And the characters will respond really lifelikely. If you don't look at the characters or engage the characters, they will start folding their arms, looking away, flipping out getting their phones out, flipping up their laptop. And in the higher difficulty levels, because there's 3 difficulty levels, one might even walk out of the room if they feel really disengaged. But really what this experience is about objective feedback. You can give people feedback on their presentation skills, but inevitably it's always colored by the person who's giving the feedback. This VR experience allows for really objective feedback, because it can feedback on, for example, how much you moved around the room. We use the Oculus Quest with this, so we can generate a heat map of were you standing still or did you move around. It can also show you your hand movements. It can feedback on the pace and the intonation of your voice. It can feedback on the volume of your voice. It can also feedback on the words that you use. So it links in with IBM Watson, and using that AI, we can show you the most common words that you use. We can also show you filler and hesitation words. So if you start every sentence with basically, it will show you basically as your most common word, or you end every sentence with okay, it will show you that word, okay? All right, so it gives a lot of feedback. And we also get people to do this twice over 2 days. So by comparing and contrasting from the start to the end with development in between, we can show objectively an improvement in people's performance. And for those of you who have delivered soft skills training, you will know that showing objective performance improvement is the major challenge of soft skills training. It's really quite difficult to do, but VR can allow you to do that, because there is no emotional involvement in the VR headset. It just shows you what you did, and it can show you how you've improved. So our 6th tip is to keep VR fresh and interesting. Raise the bar each time, try out new things. And to show you how our colleagues have responded, we're now going to play you a short video that was filmed just a couple of months ago before the lockdown, I have to say, in one of our courses.
Really good fun. I was nervous to start off with, but as you got into it, it was almost as if I was there in the room with the customer.
Really enjoyed it. Something new, something different, and a good way of learning, I thought, definitely. Yeah, it's got great potential.
brand new, it's a new innovation, it's a lot better than doing role plays.
Normally in training sessions like this, you normally do role plays with other delegates. You tend to work together, so you can often be nice to each other and help each other out, whereas in the VR headset, the scenario is real.
Loved it. Really different, exciting, challenging way to learn.
Okay, so hopefully that gave you a feel for how VR is used within Lloyds Banking Group. I'm just going to very quickly pick up about the virtual reality tools and kits. So we made the decision in 2018 to invest in Oculus as our chosen hardware provider, and that's definitely proven to be the right decision. We started off with the Oculus Go, that offers the 3 degrees of freedom to begin with, and we tried the Oculus Rift, but we found very quickly actually that the Oculus Rift was quite logistically challenging, and how we were going to use it within the classroom, it required a lot of setup, and it wasn't straightforward at all. So we very quickly made the decision not to invest further in the Oculus Rift, to continue with the Oculus Go. And that was until the Oculus Quest arrived in the summer of last year, and that really is potentially a game changer. So it's portable, it's standalone, it doesn't require any additional kit, any additional laptops, it doesn't need to be tethered to anything. Cost-wise, it's not hugely much more expensive than the Oculus Go, and it really is a next step. And it's more of a portable experience, really simple and easy for trainers and colleagues alike to use. So that then has led us now down into the Oculus Quest, which is the full 6 degrees of freedom, really creating a much more immersive learning experience compared to the Oculus Go, which was a bit more of a seated experience. So tip 7, really keep the technology simple, keep it easy to use, but choose your hardware, but really choose it based on the nature of your experiences. We've deployed it across 6 key hubs, as that slide will outline. And so therefore, what's next for VR in Lloyds Banking Group? So we're going to continue to embed it. So similar to many organisations out there, at the moment it's deployed within face-to-face training. Face-to-face training is on hold for the foreseeable future. So what does that lead us to? So there's opportunities to consider converting that virtual reality into a desktop, a laptop PC-based 2D experience. There's also the opportunity to expand our hardware. Of course, that will be driven very much by what the future holds. Content development, considering our options, buy versus build internally, thinking about whether we use CGI, computer graphics, versus 360-degree video, for example. These are all sort of areas to consider in terms of your cost and your overall budget. Implement multiplayer, multi-location. This is probably the one that's most relevant at the moment. So it's the ability to connect colleagues virtually into the same environment from multiple locations at the same time. So at the moment, you've got from one extreme to the other, you've got people together in a face-to-face room, and you have that physical interaction, that physical presence, or you have everybody remote and everybody is looking at each other through a computer screen. So the multiplayer and multi-location still keeps that ability for everybody to be remote, but have much more of a physical presence, and people will feel as though they're together collectively in the room. And finally, to wrap up the presentation, I'll just hand over to Craig just to cover off about the getting value from VR.
Yeah, so a few final kind of tips from us is think about value for money. Where can you deploy this at its biggest scale once you've done your proof of concept? I would say, I'm not going to cover each and every one of these, but I would say VR allows you to put people in an emotional space, put people in an experience which feels incredibly real. To think about what would I otherwise not be able to do in a training room or in a training experience that VR is going to allow me to do. That's what you want. You don't want it to be a gimmick. Allow people to fail safely. In a VR, there's no consequences for doing it wrong, and you can learn from that. And try and be radical. And my last one is really think about the measurement though from the start. If VR can offer fantastic measurement of anything people do in a VR experience can be measured. but it's much easier to build that in right from the start than it is to think afterwards, or how are we going to measure this? And finally, just to give some consideration to the logistics, because if you are using headsets, getting them to the right people in the right places is a challenge. So consider that from the start. And we'll just finish by refreshing you on all these tips, and that's it from us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark and Craig. Brilliant, and as you say, such an interesting example. And I still think one of the largest examples for a UK project still to be really digging into those soft skills. So absolutely fascinating and really valuable for the industry as a whole. So I'm now, we're going to go over to the other case study now, and delivering that, one second, let me just share my screen. So delivering that, we'll have Helen Dudfield, who's the Chief Scientist for Training at Kinetic, who will be joined by James Watson as well. So Immersive were the company that helped deliver this. Very different case study, far more around the scenario-based training. So I'm going to hand over to Helen, and Helen, just shout if I need to change your slides at any time and miss the cue.
All right, thanks, Emily. Emily, can you just move on to the next slide, please? Great, and the next one after that. So what I wanted to talk to you today was a project that we did starting in 2016, so it was quite a while ago now, when we were building from a research project with the Royal Navy. And this was a research project that was investigating how could you use more synthetic technology to build immersive and realistic environments, because the reliance on ships at sea is something that really isn't possible to continue with. And the reason that that's really expensive to do is, of course, anything that you do on a real platform is very expensive. The real equipment is also very valuable, so you don't want to do anything to damage it. When you train at sea, you have to take a resource with you, so you take the trainers and your trainees, so that in itself is a cost. And particularly for the Royal Navy, it was about how do we get people to be operationally ready faster, and how do we be more agile in ourselves so that we can respond to different environments. One of the really big requirements for all of industry, as well as defence and security, is how do we attract the future recruit? How do we bring people on board that are having an exciting digital experience? And one of the options that came out of this analysis was the use of virtual reality. So if we go to the next slide. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to test this and develop a vision within Kinetic, and then test that with the stakeholders, absolutely critical during this. So we created a kind of cartoon that you can see on the right-hand side that told a story, a rich narrative about what future learning could look like for the Royal Navy. And we focused on 3 key technologies: adaptive training, train changes as you go along according to how well you're doing or not; gamifying training, so motivation, engagement; and the virtual environment, which I'm going to talk about today. And this is based on evidence. So the evidence comes from academia, it came from research, it came from non-defence use cases, and it still does. So we still do lots of systemic reviews of that evidence and best practice. So the Lloyd's example is a great example for me to pick up and use for soft skills in my environment. And it's really important that telling that narrative, you engage the user and then test it with them. The first thing we did before we even got to an environment when we were developing a virtual environment was we tested that narrative to make sure it worked with them. And it did. And it excited them, and it gave them a blended solution that would mix with the real environment and currently the classroom-based and simulator-based learning. So a lot of training that goes on in my environment is either in the real system or it's with simulations of the real system, and both are very expensive. So in terms of ROI, or return on investment, I saw one of you guys asking about in questions and answer. There's quite a clear one here. But it's important as well that costs, for example, are reduced in terms of when you receive training. So a technology that's accessible anywhere, anytime, is also really important. It reduces the cost of people traveling to be together. Next slide, please, Emily. So from that building of the research, from understanding the user trainer need and the benefits, so we did a benefits heat map where we're taking the benefits both from what the Royal Navy are requiring all the way down through the training cycle. So what does this realize by doing this kind of technology? And we then engage with the end users and the stakeholders. The stakeholders are not just the people delivering that piece of training. The stakeholders include the people involved, for example, in the IT side. It's really important that your stakeholder mapping here and the views of those stakeholders are reflected. So once we tested and refined with the stakeholders that narrative, we then started to look to the marketplace. And you can see along the bottom here a very kind of engaging doodle that we also used. We looked at the technology market. We did a technology road mapping, and we still do and update those. We considered a very early return on investment, and we thought about the use of virtual reality. And that's when we came across Immersive and with James. Back then, Tom Simmons was the person still now in charge of that company, and Justin Perry. And with them and other vendors, we started to look at how could they meet our training need. And we did that by creating a narrative into a rich scenario. So imagine a big Excel spreadsheet here, and you've got the scenario down the side, scenario coming from observation of the real training environment and the simulator, and also a pile of training material, which we then had to make shareable to the open market. And we picked a particular scenario out of that we created training goals against. And then we went and looked at the technologies and assessed which would meet these needs, but also be the most value to look at. Next slide, please, Emily. And that's how we came up with working with Immersive and creating this submarine environment that you can see on the right-hand side in an agile manner, which was the first time that we worked in this way. So I'm going to ask James just to describe the technology to you, and then I'll carry on with a story as to what we did with that technology.
Thanks, Helen. It's actually amazing to think this was 2016.
I know.
You know, pretty much 4 years ago, the level this went to, it was quite ahead of the time if you think about it and where we are now. So interesting in that context. But I mean, it was such a good use case to bring technology, this VR technology, to bear on, when you consider, as Helen said, you know, training people on submarines is not only expensive, but B, there's also the fact that you're having to use in effect, live piece of kit that arguably should be deployed doing other things. So, you know, bringing that training, as Helen said, from offshore to onshore, really important. But so what we did is we built this scenario. In effect, we kind of pretty much built a submarine in VR, various different areas within that with different scenarios. You also had the ability to communicate by voice with people in different parts of the submarine. So there was a real kind of level of complexity here that was brought in. And once again, context of 4 years ago, you know, things would be a lot simpler to do now, but back then it was, you know, something that was certainly pushing out the boundaries of what the technology could do. But I think one of the things we worked really closely with Helen on, and what really resonated with why Kinetic partnered with us, was, you know, the ability to measure what goes on in these scenarios. So Emily already sort of referenced this ROI piece. Well, you know, you have to have the data in order to then understand what the performance levels are, what the challenges are, all the things that will ultimately enable you to turn around and say, you know, we train people faster, we train people more effectively, people retain their knowledge better, in which case you need to train them less often, there's a cost saving, all those things that can only come to bear with data. And in this scenario, you know, there's huge amounts of data that gets generated. The platform this sits on, our virtual enterprise platform, captures 30 data points per user per second. So the parameters are, you can measure whatever you need to measure within that environment. Is it someone has looked in a certain direction? Is it someone has turned the dial the right number of clicks? Is it that they have given a certain command at that point? All these things can be measured. They then all build into a picture you can use to actually demonstrate to the wider business what kind of ROI that's driving. And there's also an interesting aspect to this that was a particular requirement from Helen and the team, which was basically the ability to go back in and look at a training session and actually critique and mark that training session. So within the forces, it's called after action review. We called it sort of record and review. You have in effect a VR recording that you're able to go into. You could either look at that on a web browser, which is the screen you can see bottom right there, and a trainer could mark a trainee, and you've got little milestones along the side there where they're able to give them either a pass, fail, or make a comment. Or you can indeed even go back into the VR recording itself with a headset and view it from that angle, which gets a little sort of mind-bending, because you could actually have a trainee go back into their training and watch them perform a task with a trainer next to them telling them what they did wrong. Which definitely starts to bend your mind a bit, but it's something that is incredibly useful from a perspective of how you actually assess people within that. That's me. So back to you, Helen.
Great. If you can go to the next slide, please, Emily, that'd be brilliant. So we've selected that technology. At the time, there were only a few people in virtual reality for individual, and Immersive was first to market with the team-based virtual reality, which was the key thing for us. So you can see here my submarine, which allows multiple people to be in the virtual reality environment together. And that was really critical. That was very disruptive to the market. That caused a lot of excitement. And we built a demonstration called Excite. So one of the interesting parts of learning in that demonstration, by the way, was we used agile design, and we used agile sprint-based methodology, which was new to us. We're very conventional at that point. So we're talking 2017, 2018. So we did agile sprints within us. We weren't even physically together. We'd put our VR helmets on and we'd join together. We'd put a submariner into that virtual environment, and he would walk around and go, well, the ceiling's too tall, or it would never look like that. And then we started to have more and more end users involved in the assessment of the technology, launching and refining and maturing the technology. And you can see down there the kind of place that you can go and watch it and have a look on YouTube for that use case in itself. What I would say is really important about this design is that we needed to be able to demonstrate the ability for a trainer to be in the environment, whether they're on a desktop or whether they're in virtual reality. So now a trainer can be walking around with the trainees, moving around this virtual submarine, or they can be on a desktop giving feedback, and we can capture competencies so we can see that training objectives are being met. And we can have that after action review that James talked about, absolutely critical for my environment. And because you have to have the competent people ready to go and do these very high risk environments, whether it's emergency services, whether it's fire, oil and gas, these are environments where you have to make sure that mistakes are avoided, absolutely. Next slide, please. So, what did we do? Well, we demonstrated that we could follow a vision that was set out by the Navy to train ashore and then validate at sea. So this would, reduce the training load on the actual live platforms. And then the second thing here was that modernization training strategy to modernize the learning experience for the users. And this resulted in effective training and time compressed training. So I suppose the really important thing here, the messages I would say, is evidence-based, and the evidence is growing all the time. So we do a lot of research where we're finding lots of evidence coming from the medical environment, from the soft skill environment, demonstrating how virtual reality is improving training effectiveness. And we asked about return on investment. Well, recently we had to look at the use of this kind of capability as a return on investment. So we needed to understand, was it worth doing? And in order to do that, we captured the cost of the trainer, the cost of the students, the travel and subsistence of students moving to different sites. And we had to make some assumptions about the courses. And we were looking to see that using virtual reality was more cost effective than that. Because the important thing here is to do it, you've got to invest initially to get that essential content into whichever platform you use. And then downstream, you've got to show not only is it more engaging, it's more effective, but it's also cost efficient as well. So that's a big element we've spent a lot of time doing. And the other side of it is making sure that we understand the risks. The risks really in terms of implementing this within a very traditional environment of face-to-face teaching. So you have to make sure that the IT infrastructure and the security of data and the use of devices, etc., is all suitable for the environment that we're delivering the solution in. So we learned a lot from doing return on investment. If we can go to the next slide. So what do we do? Well, confession time, I'm a human-centered design specialist, I'm a psychologist, and it was based on psychological principle and on basic training, understanding user needs and a learning strategy. So it came from there. And then it moved into this rapid agile design phase, which was something revolutionary, faster, something that would have taken us months, took us weeks. It was so radical. And the content, creating content and gathering realistic content from anywhere, making an environment that people would like, well, this is just like the real thing. So it's really important that you innovate, that you share those learning visions. Got to remember there's a cultural change issue here, because you're blending new technologies, and you've got to ground it in expertise of technology, of training, of human science. And you need to make sure that you have the evidence to provide, both in terms of cost and in terms of effectiveness. And I hope that sharing that with you is useful. And I hope that you get a chance to have a look at it. But what I would say is that I have school children coming in here, and anyone from 8, 9 goes into my summary, runs amok all over the place, and just uses it as if it was, normal every day for them. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you, James, as well. Really fascinating to see how you replicated a submarine environment in as close to form as possible in 3D. Is truly inspirational, I think, and really shows, how you can push this. So I'm going to try and wrap up relatively quickly now so that we leave a little bit of time for the panel session and for you to ask some questions as well. So please keep typing in a few questions if you want to ask any of the speakers, or as I say, we've got both Sam from Make Real and James will be there as well. So just takeaways really from what we've learned from both Lloyds and Kinetic. Some of the key considerations that you need to consider when starting a new project and throughout that process. So obviously it's very important to identify the right appropriate use cases. You can see that both Lloyds and Kinetic spent quite a lot of time looking at those different scenarios and which ones might be applicable to transfer into Immersive. You've then got the design, and it's absolutely fundamental, that content design and the user experience, both once people are inside that content, but also leading up to getting in that headset. So what's the approach? How are you planning on getting people in there? How are you planning to get people headsets if they are at home? All of these thoughts. There's then the actual delivery itself. So which hardware are you using? There's lots of choices out there. And how are you going to use a test? So before you start scaling, as you learned, there's the agile framework that needs to be utilized in order for that prototype to be tested, iterated before you start further developing and deploying it. And then that's exactly it, the deployment, scaling up, how you integrate into your actual IT system if you want to do that, how you work with existing a kind of IT frameworks at your organizations, and how you can get it out to a larger number of people. And then that data, most importantly, how do you actually start learning from the data that you're now able to get back from your trainees? You're collecting this huge array of new data about how they're learning. How do you actually use that to improve the process and to bespokely deliver training on a personal level? So we're not going to have really enough time, unfortunately, on this webinar to talk about the importance of content, but I thought I'd just use this slide to demonstrate it as easily as possible. This is why it's very important to start afresh in regards to your design theory when you're looking at creating an immersive experience. In 2D, the interaction design is quite simple. It's designing for flat screens, such as monitors, touch screens, and your level of interactions are very limited. You can click, you can scroll, that's about it. When you're designing something in 3D, you are designing for spatial computing. You've got the whole 3D world around you. You've got 6 degrees of freedom to move around, and therefore the ways in which you can interact with the user and objects in that space are far, far broader. So this is why it's very important to consider these things very early and to design accordingly so that you don't waste money in your projects. And just demonstrating this slide, I don't expect you to all be able to read it. The ecosystem within the UK is growing rapidly. And what I mean is the number of companies that are able to answer certain elements of your challenges. So we've got immersive content studios like Make Real and Immersive both in this call. There are then, of course, distribution and integration platforms that allow you to scale and take your VR content wider across the company. And again, Immersive, a great example of that. You've got your creation tools that exist, the hardware and haptics. And then, of course, there's more and more companies coming into the space that have off-the-shelf offerings as well. So training platforms and tools that you can buy and deliver in a more standardized fashion. The reason I bring this up is that the ecosystem is growing, which is fantastic, but it does mean it can be hard to navigate if you're new to all of this. And really that's where I want to wrap up from the Digital Catapult side of things, which is this is where we're here to help. We as Catapult want to enable more and more companies to be able to take their first steps in this area, whether you are an enterprise company in manufacturing space or more in the professional services or finance, or retail, wherever you are, or maybe you are a training company that already exists. You already exist and you deliver traditional training, but now you want to shift across and be able to deliver more immersively. We are there to try and make you a more intelligent customer and to really guide you when you're procuring your immersive training content and developing your approach. So how to develop that brief, how to actually think about, you know, what's an appropriate price tag to be putting on it, designing the approach. We can work with you on a whole framework of different considerations around what you're trying to achieve in order to actually understand what is the best approach. Do you want to be starting from scratch? Do you want to be getting something off the shelf? And we can help you therefore to deliver that prototype. And we will be working with a whole range of the studios and companies out there. As you've seen, there's a whole wonderful ecosystem, companies like Immersive, Make Real. We will always look to partner with them to work out what the best way is to deliver something for your company and get you started on your journey. So I'll help you navigate that ecosystem, and we'll be able to give advice on the best ways to use a test as well, and basically allow you to interact with your delivery partner of choice in a way that's most valuable. So we're there to try and take some of the fears away in its first instance. We very much suggest that, you know, if you want to talk further about this, of course, get in touch and do share with your industries, with your HR departments, etc. Just on the right hand side, there is kind of a brief summary of what I mean in terms of how we can help. But now I'm gonna quickly try and open up to our panel and where we can just have more of a conversation as to some of the learnings that they have had. So introducing back again, we've got Sam Watts from Make Real, we've got James Watson from Immerse, we've got Aki on our side. So from Digital Catapult, Aki is an immersive experience researcher and designer and works with lots of companies in the way that I just described to help them on that initial journey. So thank you so much, guys, for joining here. I'm just gonna, open up some questions on the other computer. There we go. And so I do encourage anyone else, if you've still got a question that's on the top of your mind, please do type it in. I'll ask a couple and then very much it'd be great to have you. So Sam, I'm going to start off with you. I think something that's often been said around, you know, using immersive content and using avatars and building these, you know, scenarios, basically using games engine type tools, is that they don't always necessarily feel realistic. So what are some of the latest developments that you guys at Make Real have been doing? And I know there are many that you've been doing to try and enable as realistic an environment for, you know, the types of training that we saw that you've delivered for Lloyd's. What are some of the latest developments in that space? Because I think it's very obvious that in the last 3-4 years, an awful lot's happened since 2016, for example.
Indeed. I mean, when I first joined the sort of learning and development industry 2 decades ago, the thought of 3D content for learning was always assumed it came with huge cost. Obviously, computers and compute power have vastly increased since then, as have the tools that we use to create the content. But you know, the thing that we use for learning, our brain, works with us but works against us in terms of levels of realism for when dealing with virtual characters. We've all heard of, hopefully, the uncanny valley. So if a character is too lifelike or too realistic, our brain gets confused because we know it's not a real human, but we're starting to be fooled that it is a real human. And then that actually counts as a counterpoint to learning, because we're thinking more about, oh, that's a bit weird looking, as opposed to, oh, here's a believable character who I connect to, who I empathize with, who I can learn from, communicate with, etc. But then the brain also works with us, especially in VR, because it's very good at filling in the gaps. So they don't necessarily have to be super realistic. But realism is more than just the visual. It's about the movement. It's about the scripts. It's about the voice, the actual connection, the interpersonal connections that you have with that person. So what we've been doing, and thankfully Mark and Craig's presentation has a lot of great images and examples where you can see the quality of visuals has improved. But what it doesn't really show over a streamed Zoom video is the quality of the animations and the lip syncing to add that sort of more level of believability and realism. So whilst working with Lloyds over the number of years is to improve and create our own internal tool chains and our own tool sets to help them reduce the costs. So whilst there is a cost difference between personal vitality and resilience, the first course, and relationship manager, most of that is actually down, it's not down to the characters looking better, it's down to the complexity of the scripts and the dialogues and the interactions and the measurements and the outcomes. So one of the things we've done is we've created our own tool called Dialogic, which makes it easier for a script writer and a coder who has to put all of that script and dialogue in logic into action, that they can work together seamlessly from one file, rather than having to repeat the work and double it all up and adding to the development time and cost.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah, that's really interesting to hear that actually there's whole changes in the process going on in the back end in order to power that natural feeling at the front end that the actual user feels. All right, thanks for that, Sam. Brilliant. Aki, I know we touched lightly and really lightly on the kind of scenarios that make sense for immersive, and what are some of the ones that are really valuable to be lifting and shifting into a 3D format. I know as a designer and an experienced designer specifically, you've got some kind of, I guess, more general rules and principles as to how you think about that. How can you share more, enlighten us around that topic, please?
Yeah, thanks, Emily, and hello, everyone. So I think one useful concept from sort of more from an academic context to think about many of the things that have been described and talked about today is this couple of things. So first of all, presence. So that is really the unique thing that VR can bring us, that sense of presence in another world or space. And what then happens in that space is that enables us to do things, and that relates to this notion of embodied cognition. So that presence, when it's embodied in the sense that you see, for instance, your hands. So besides being able to sort of take in the 360 environment, you see your hands and you really feel present in that space. So designing for that kind of presence and designing for those things that these technologies enable is important. And that notion of embodied cognition is really about how we not only think with our brains, but we also think with our bodies. And therefore, you should design for making and asking people to do things, learn by doing. And I think that's the case studies given evidence of that, okay, people have been put into a scenario and they've been asked to act out something that in a more traditional teaching material, they might have been reading or just watching a representation of that sequence of events and so on and so forth. So understanding the capability of the technology and really leveraging it is key.
Yeah, I like that. Definitely get people doing. It's all about considering those actual active tasks, whether they are physically or mentally active, I guess is the key thing. All right, thanks for that, Aki. Brilliant. I mean, James, I mean, you've now worked on a whole range of different customer projects. As we heard there, the Kinetic one was actually a little while back, and you've had all sorts of customers since then. But what are some of the, from your point of view, some of the key considerations that you think are really important for a customer or a client to have thought about as they start the early days of jumping into this? We've run through some of them on the presentation, but from your point of view, what are some of the screamers when you think, oh my God, why didn't they just take half an hour to think through that before they jumped into the conversation with you guys? Oh, I think you might be on mute. Sorry, James.
Yeah, we do get some quite interesting requests that we are sort of sometimes have to very politely sort of suggest maybe it needs a little bit more thought. Obviously very politely, of course. But, it does come down to, they have to have thought through what the right use case is. Virtual reality has amazing properties. Aki was just talking about the presence piece and, what retention that drives. So it does some incredible things. It doesn't solve every single training scenario. It isn't the solution to everything. It is another amazing tool to put in the toolbox. And so I think, sometimes people get a little carried away with the technology for technology's sake, which means, they haven't necessarily thought through the right use case. So that's the simple starting point, as any decent sort of business person will do, is like, what are you trying to achieve? Is this the right technology? Don't start with the technology and try and fit it into the organization because you think it's super cool, which I agree, I think it is, but it has to have the right use case. So that, it sounds blindingly obvious, but it's actually not always thought through. So you need to do that. Couple of other things. I mean, there's a ton of things to consider, right through from hardware to all sorts of other aspects, but a little bit back to the use case. What is success going to look like for the organization? What is a successful rollout of a VR training program? Which, once again, pretty obvious, but success needs to be demonstrable, and for it to be demonstrable, it needs data. So how are you going to measure this initiative? What does that look like? And it's not good enough just to be using the latest technology. You have to then be able to go away and say, as I mentioned, talking about Kinetic, what has it achieved? Why should the CEO sign off more budget to roll that out? Is it having an impact on, staff engagement? Is it improving efficiency, reducing costs? What are those criteria? So those need to be thought out up front, along with making sure it's the right use case. And I think where the market's getting to now is very interesting, because I do think there's quite a shift from sort of why use it. I think there's a bit more of an understanding of what value it can bring. Still work to be done there. So there's a bit of a shift from why use it VR for training to how do I do it. So the thing there that the big challenge organizations are finding is, how do they take sort of the VR pilot they've rolled out, which is perhaps a slightly standalone piece within the organizational structure. It isn't particularly integrated. How do they take that, integrate it into the wider organization, and then scale that across the organization? So that is a challenge that our platform addresses, and a question that is coming up much more now. It's like, yeah, I get it, but how do I do it? How am I going to really make that impactful? So, there's lots of other things, but I think right use case, make sure you're measuring the right things, work out how you're going to get maximum value by scaling and deploying it.
And on that scaling note, when people do get to that stage, and given that is, that's obviously a bit further down the line for some people that might be tuning in, but what are some of the kind of, I guess, key, there's technology to help people scale, such as your platform, but what are some of the key, I guess, departments that people tend to have needed to have engaged with, and who are the parts of the business that are normally going to be pretty critical to actually making this happen and work and be, get uptake from employees?
I mean, there's a fairly sort of tried path of how this progresses through an organization. So quite often, not always, but quite often it'll start with the innovation discipline. So there'll be the people out there hunting for the technology that can be transformative. It then kind of moves more into the wider business as the business takes it on, having improved within innovation. And then as the wider business takes it on, obviously then the key part is if you are going to roll out a sort of full platform deployment, which integrates with all existing systems like learning management systems, at that point you're obviously getting IT involved to start working out how does this actually fit within the sort of broader infrastructure of the company. And obviously that, getting involved with IT is a very different consideration once you've moved sort of through those other phases. So, they have an important role to play in this for sure. I mean, this is the assumption being once you get to that point of kind of deployment, all the learning and development, they're on board, they understand, they see the value, but then you've got to make sure that actual sort of final hurdle is addressed, which, as we all know, IT, have a lot on their plate. They have a lot of priorities. They have long roadmaps. So getting them to buy in can sometimes be challenging.
Yeah, I bet that's the tricky bit. Absolutely. All right. Well, I think we've had a few questions that have been asked, and actually, you guys as speakers have been very efficient in answering away here. But I thought it might be worth us just expanding a little bit on the question that came in from someone anonymous around what are the biggest roadblocks and challenges to implementing this tech for training specifically. I feel we probably touched on some of them, but maybe Sam, I know you typed out an answer there, but just to expand a little bit on exactly that, some of the biggest challenges that you see people hitting, either at the beginning of a project or halfway through, what can cause a project to be delayed or slow down or lose traction?
Well, I think many of those challenges have probably been addressed throughout the various parts of the presentation, but to sort of summarise, it's getting the right stakeholders on board early on at the start of the journey. Treating it as a journey and a learning experience that you're going to go on together with your vendor and with your suppliers. If you are starting out and learning, then it's good to be involved with those people early on. Don't just send someone else off to go and do it, and then when it comes back already ready and packaged, suddenly find all these problems in terms of integration and wider rollout. Procurement, IT, they need to be involved early on so they understand data, privacy, security, how it plugs into their system, and how they're going to buy it and what their responsibilities are. But as James was saying, in terms of the different departments and people who you work with, having stakeholders from each department, whether it be the digital department, the innovation department, L&D team, the R&D team, procurement, etc., having somebody engaged early on leads for a much smoother path overall, because this is exciting technology and news will spread within an organization. And if another department gets wind of it and feels that they should have been involved, then that's going to be a barrier put up because they want to get involved or take over. So if you're all working together from the onset, it's a whole lot easier to ensure that you end up at a smooth deployment.
Yeah, so use the power of envy to your advantage, basically. Get everyone on board. Yeah. So so that jealousy works with you, not against. Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. Aki, I was going to ask, someone's obviously been asking on the question and answers around obviously not having felt like they've experienced much immersive gaming kind of experiences so far. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute as well about some of the labs, etc., that do exist. But Aki, from your point of view, do you think having a taster of some of the other non-training related experiences that are out there, is that a good way for people to understand a bit more about this, spatial design and how 3D environments work?
Well, I would say yes and no. I mean, I certainly recommend the more high-end games in the VR space as well. Games like Beat Saber, games like Half-Life, Alyx, which are really the state of the art in terms of their interaction design. And as with other forms of interactive media, games tend to drive the most sort of sophisticated and also fun interactions. So there's lots of references, also some games like Vacation Simulator or Job Simulator are really accessible and really exemplify good design. But also, I mean, there's lots of interesting applications in the more sort of productivity side of things. So Tilt Brush, which is basically a tool with which you can draw and sculpt in a 3D space. It's very accessible and it's just magical in many ways. Again, illustrating what VR is really about. So I would really recommend looking past the obvious sort of, and not really think about VR in this case as a gaming platform, but how could you take those sort of engaging and fun interactions from that domain into your learning outcomes, really.
Yeah, and I think on that note, in terms of how to get a taster of VR, I realise it is a tricky one at the moment with lots of places shut. You're right, you know, Digital Catapult have a lab that's available for SMEs to use. There are various arcades around the country. Definitely several in London. It's worth searching in your local city to see if there are arcades that you can go and access. And it's worth mentioning now that headsets do not cost the earth anymore. And that's a really kind of big and massive change that's happened in the last few years, that good quality headsets, like the Oculus ones that you can get that are standalone, they don't need to plug into a computer. You can now get them for more of the kind of couple hundred mark, which I know is still not cheap, but they're coming down. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that there are lots of augmented reality apps available on your phone. So you can start getting that impression of what augmented reality and 3D objects are like simply by using your high-end smartphone as well. So I think just understanding, like Aki says, how the 3D interaction works is well worth it. Right, I am realizing the time here, so it's probably going to be time to wrap up soon, but I will let all of you as speakers say any closing thoughts, any last suggestions or advice that you would have for anyone that's considering the daunting next step of maybe looking at using immersive now that COVID is affecting their company's normal operations so much. Any lasting, I know it's a hard question always, but lasting one-liner, but feel free to step forwards if you have anything.
I'll have a go. I mean, I would just say, think about it is transformative technology, but just think about it in the way you would any other approach to what are you trying to solve and what do you want to come out of it. So don't treat it differently from other projects.
Yeah, I think building upon that as well is, you know, don't expect it to replace your existing training, and look to use it to complement, blend in with, and as Emily said earlier on, treat it as another tool within your tool set for learning.
Excellent.
Yeah, one more thing maybe that if you're in the position to commission immersive work in this space, it is useful to get that baseline understanding of what are the best experiences out there, because and try to sort of articulate why they are good and what works and what doesn't, because then you become a better client. So, and you reduce that communication overhead with the studios that you're working with. You know better what you want, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, try and, as it sounds like, you know, there's some people out there that have been listening. Try and do that. Try and educate yourself, whether it's through your phone or whether it's through a headset that you make the exception of buying. But just understand what's good and what works. But I'd like to thank everyone, all of the speakers, first of all, for contributing. It's really been very interesting for ourselves and for each other to understand what's going on. And, you know, thank you for pushing the boundaries, both on the creators that have joined, James and Sam, as well as Helen and Mark and Craig for really, you know, taking those early leaps basically for industry. So thanks so much for joining us. Thank you everyone that tuned in. As we said, this is recorded. We'll share it out there, share it with everyone that signed up, and allow you to continue sharing it on there as well. And please feel free, as we say, to get in touch with Digital Catapult if you've got queries around this area or anything that's immersive based for your company. That's exactly what we're there to do, to help and support. So on that note, I wish you all, hope you're all safe and well, and hopefully we look forward to having you all back in our offices in Euston Road when we're reopen again in the near future. So thanks ever so much. Thank you, speakers, and we'll leave it there. Have a good evening.